The mortar shell that changed everything exploded at 0347 hours on December 16, 1944, in a snow-covered forest clearing near the Belgian village of Malmedy. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 106th Infantry Division had been leading a reconnaissance patrol when German artillery from the opening barrage of the Battle of the Bulge caught his squad in the open, turning what should have been a routine mission into a nightmare of shrapnel and smoke. The 23-year-old sergeant from Chicago felt the hot metal tear through his left leg and abdomen before the sound of the explosion reached his ears. The impact threw him against a massive pine tree with enough force to crack 2 ribs and leave him gasping for breath in the blood-stained snow. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear his squad calling for medics, but their voices seemed to be coming from impossibly far away. Sarge, can you hear me?" Private Danny Walsh's voice cut through the battlefield noise as the young soldier from Boston crawled toward O'Brien's position, his own uniform torn by shrapnel and his hands shaking from a combination of cold and shock. "You're hit bad, but we're going to get you out of here." But even as Walsh spoke the words, both men knew that medical evacuation was unlikely. German forces were advancing on multiple fronts, American lines were collapsing throughout the Ardennes, and the sounds of approaching enemy vehicles meant that capture or death were the most probable outcomes for wounded soldiers who couldn't retreat with their units. O'Brien struggled to maintain consciousness as blood seeped through his field dressing and into the frozen ground beneath him. His medical training told him that he was bleeding internally. The metallic taste in his mouth and the growing weakness in his limbs were unmistakable signs of severe trauma that required immediate surgical intervention. Without proper medical care within hours, he would die slowly in the Belgian snow. "Danny," he whispered, grabbing Walsh's jacket with a grip that was already weakening, "you need to get out of here. Germans will be here soon. Don't let them capture you because of me." Walsh looked around at the chaos of the German advance. Burning American vehicles, scattered equipment, and the distant sound of Panzer engines grinding through the forest. Logic dictated that he should follow orders to retreat, but abandoning a wounded comrade violated every principle of military brotherhood that had sustained them through 6 months of combat. "I'm not leaving you, Sarge," Walsh replied firmly, though his voice betrayed the fear they both felt. "We'll figure something out. Maybe we can find a hiding spot until our guys counterattack." The hope was admirable, but unrealistic. German forces were advancing with overwhelming superiority, American resistance was crumbling, and winter weather made survival without shelter virtually impossible for wounded personnel. O'Brien understood that Walsh's loyalty, while touching, was likely to result in both their deaths or capture. As German voices grew audible through the forest, Walsh made a desperate decision that would save his sergeant's life while sacrificing his own freedom. Spotting a small hunting cabin partially hidden by evergreen trees about 200 yards from their position, he began the agonizing process of dragging O'Brien through the snow toward potential shelter. "There's a building," Walsh explained through gritted teeth as he struggled with O'Brien's dead weight. "Maybe we can hide until you're strong enough to move, or until the situation changes." The cabin was a simple wooden structure that had obviously been used by local hunters before the war transformed the peaceful Ardennes forest into a battlefield. Inside, Walsh found basic furniture, a stone fireplace, and most importantly, a supply of firewood that could provide warmth during what would certainly be a long, cold night. But as Walsh was settling O'Brien on a makeshift bed near the fireplace, the sound of approaching footsteps made it clear that their hiding place had been discovered. Through the cabin's single window, Walsh could see German soldiers moving methodically through the forest, checking every potential hiding spot for American survivors. "Danny," O'Brien whispered urgently, understanding that capture was now inevitable. "When they find us, tell them I'm unconscious. Maybe they'll focus on you and not notice how bad I'm hurt." The strategy was their only hope for survival. German treatment of wounded American prisoners varied dramatically, depending on circumstances and the attitudes of individual commanders. A conscious American soldier might be interrogated or executed, while an unconscious one might simply be left to die quietly. Walsh had barely hidden his rifle and assumed a position beside O'Brien when the cabin door opened to reveal 2 figures silhouetted against the snowy landscape. But instead of German soldiers, 2 women entered the cabin, an elderly lady carrying a medical bag and a younger woman whose nurse's uniform was visible beneath her heavy winter coat. "Mein Gott," whispered the younger woman, whose name was Ingrid Hoffmann, and who served as a volunteer nurse at the local hospital in nearby Malmedy. "Ein amerikanischer Soldat. He's badly wounded." Her companion, Dr. Martha Weber, a 70-year-old physician who had been practicing medicine since before the First World War, immediately knelt beside O'Brien to assess his injuries. Her trained hands quickly identified the severity of his wounds, while her experienced eyes evaluated his chances for survival without immediate surgical intervention. Internal bleeding, possible perforated bowel, severe blood loss, Dr. E. Weber diagnosed in German before switching to careful English. "This man will die without surgery. We must get him to the hospital immediately." Walsh stared at the two German women in amazement, unable to process what was happening. Everything in his military training had taught him to expect brutality or indifference from enemy civilians. Yet here were German medical personnel offering to save the life of an American soldier who should have been their enemy. You're going to help him?" Walsh asked in disbelief. "But we're Americans, we're your enemies." Dr. Weber looked up from her examination with an expression of gentle reproach that reminded Walsh of his own grandmother. "Young man," she replied in heavily accented English, "I took an oath to preserve life and relieve suffering. That oath mentions nothing about nationality or politics." The comment reflected a professional ethic that transcended wartime propaganda, but it also demonstrated personal courage that could result in severe punishment if German military authorities discovered that local medical personnel were treating enemy soldiers. Providing aid to American forces was considered treason under Nazi law, punishable by execution or deportation to concentration camps. Ingrid had been examining Walsh's minor wounds while Dr. Weber focused on O'Brien's life-threatening injuries. The young nurse, whose brother had been killed fighting American forces in Normandy 6 months earlier, struggled with emotions that contradicted her professional training and human instincts. "Herr Doctor," she said quietly in German, "if we help them, the SS will execute us all. You know what happened to the medical personnel in Stavelot who were accused of collaboration." Dr. Weber paused in her examination, understanding the terrible risk they were taking, but unable to ignore the medical emergency before her. Throughout her long career, she had treated patients regardless of their politics, religion, or nationality, believing that medical ethics required universal compassion rather than selective mercy. "Ingrid," she replied firmly, "this man is dying. If we do nothing, he will be dead within hours. I cannot stand by and watch someone die when I have the skill to save him." The decision to help O'Brien represented more than medical ethics. It was a fundamental choice between human compassion and political loyalty that would define the character of everyone involved. Dr. Weber and Ingrid were choosing to risk their lives for the principle that suffering human beings deserved care regardless of the uniform they wore. O'Brien drifted in and out of consciousness during the crucial conversation that would determine his fate. Through waves of pain and morphine-induced confusion, he caught fragments of German and English that suggested his captors were actually trying to save his life rather than interrogate or execute him. "Is this real?" he whispered to Walsh during a moment of relative clarity. "Are German doctors really trying to help me?" Walsh squeezed his sergeant's hand reassuringly, though he was equally confused by the situation. "I think so, Sarge. I think these people are trying to save your life." As Dr. Weber and Ingrid prepared to transport O'Brien to medical facilities where his wounds could be properly treated, Walsh faced his own moment of decision. He could surrender to these apparently humanitarian Germans and hope for similar treatment, or he could attempt escape while his sergeant received medical care. The choice would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the safety of the German women who were risking everything to save an enemy soldier's life. Their act of mercy had created moral obligations that extended far beyond the immediate medical emergency, binding former enemies together in a conspiracy of compassion that transcended the artificial boundaries of warfare. The journey from the forest cabin to Malmedy's small hospital took place under cover of darkness, with Dr. Weber and Ingrid navigating back roads to avoid German checkpoints, where the presence of wounded American soldiers would have meant immediate arrest for everyone involved. O'Brien lay unconscious in the back of Dr. Weber's pre-war Mercedes sedan, his life hanging by threads that grew more tenuous with each passing mile. "His pulse is weakening," Ingrid whispered, as she monitored O'Brien's vital signs during the tense drive through occupied territory. "We may be too late. He's lost so much blood that surgery might not be possible." Dr. Weber gripped the steering wheel tighter, understanding that time was their greatest enemy. Her hospital had operated throughout the German occupation, with limited supplies and constant scrutiny from military authorities, who viewed medical resources as military assets rather than humanitarian necessities. "If we can get him to the operating room, there is still hope," she replied, though her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had seen too many battlefield casualties die despite the best medical efforts. The human body can survive remarkable trauma when given proper care. Walsh had chosen to accompany O'Brien rather than attempt escape, reasoning that his presence might somehow help protect the German women who were risking their lives for humanitarian principles. His decision meant accepting capture and potential execution, but abandoning his wounded sergeant seemed like a betrayal of military brotherhood that he couldn't accept. The Malmedy Hospital was a modest facility that had been built in 1923 to serve the region's rural population. Under German occupation, it operated with skeleton staff and severely limited supplies, yet Dr. Weber had maintained standards of care that reflected her pre-war medical training rather than wartime expedients. "Nurse Hoffman," Dr. Weber instructed as they carried O'Brien into the hospital's emergency area, "prepare the surgical suite for emergency abdominal surgery. We'll need anesthesia, surgical instruments, and whatever blood supplies we can gather." The request presented immediate challenges in a facility that had been stripped of resources by military requisitions. Anesthesia was rationed for German military casualties, surgical instruments were often borrowed rather than owned, and blood supplies were virtually non-existent since most healthy donors were serving with Wehrmacht units. But Ingrid had worked in the hospital throughout the occupation and had developed creative solutions to resource shortages that kept the facility functioning despite impossible conditions. Her network of contacts among local women included volunteers who could provide blood donations, and her knowledge of medical supply chains allowed her to borrow equipment from military medical units. "I can arrange blood donors within an hour," she assured Dr. Weber while preparing the operating room. "Mrs. Brennan and her daughters have the right blood type, and they've helped us before with emergency cases." The reference to previous emergency cases suggested that O'Brien was not the first Allied soldier to receive clandestine medical care at the Malmedy Hospital. Dr. Weber and her staff had apparently been operating an informal network that provided humanitarian assistance to casualties from both sides of the conflict. As preparations for surgery continued, Walsh found himself assigned to a small storage room where he could remain hidden while his sergeant received medical treatment. The irony of an American soldier hiding in a German hospital while enemy doctors saved his comrade's life was not lost on him, but it demonstrated how individual acts of compassion could transcend the artificial divisions created by political ideology. Sister Marie Claire, the elderly French nun who managed the hospital's nursing staff, brought Walsh clean clothes and a simple meal while explaining the risks that everyone was taking to save O'Brien's life. "The SS patrol this area regularly," she warned in careful English. "If they discover an American soldier being treated here, they will execute Dr. Weber, Nurse Hoffman, and probably everyone else on the medical staff." The information about potential consequences made Walsh acutely aware of the magnitude of sacrifice being made on their behalf. These German women were risking not only their own lives, but the lives of their colleagues and patients to uphold medical principles that recognized no national boundaries. Dr. Weber's surgery on O'Brien lasted nearly 4 hours, during which time she removed shrapnel from his abdomen, repaired damaged organs, and addressed internal bleeding that had brought him close to death. Working with minimal anesthesia and improvised equipment, she demonstrated surgical skills that would have been impressive under ideal conditions and were remarkable under wartime constraints. "The surgery was successful," she announced to the waiting staff as dawn light began to filter through the hospital's blackout curtains. "He will live, but recovery will require weeks of careful nursing and physical rehabilitation." The prospect of hiding and caring for an American soldier for an extended period created logistical challenges that went far beyond the immediate medical emergency. O'Brien would need daily medical attention, proper nutrition during recovery, and complete concealment from German military authorities, who conducted regular inspections of medical facilities. Ingrid had already begun planning the deception that would be necessary to maintain O'Brien's safety during his recovery period. The hospital's patient records would list him as Heinrich Weber, a German civilian injured in an industrial accident, while his actual identity would be known only to the core group of medical staff involved in his care. "We have experience with creating false identities for patients who need protection," Ingrid explained to Walsh as they discussed the arrangements. "During the early days of occupation, we treated Jewish refugees and resistance fighters using similar methods." The revelation that the hospital had been operating as a sanctuary for various categories of people in danger demonstrated a level of organized humanitarian resistance that contradicted assumptions about German civilian compliance with Nazi policies. Dr. Weber and her staff had been quietly subverting military authority through medical ethics that recognized human dignity regardless of political circumstances. O'Brien regained consciousness on his second day at the hospital, initially confused about his location and the identity of the people caring for him. The sight of German nurses checking his vital signs and adjusting his bandages created cognitive dissonance that required careful explanation. "Where am I?" he whispered to Ingrid during one of her routine medical checks. "Are you German? Am I a prisoner?" Ingrid smiled gently while recording his temperature and pulse rate. "You are in a hospital and you are safe," she replied in English that had improved dramatically since his arrival. "We are taking care of you because that is what medical people do. We help sick and hurt people." The explanation was simple but profound in its implications. O'Brien was discovering that his supposed enemies were treating him with more compassion and skill than he might have received in some American military hospitals, demonstrating that professional medical ethics could transcend national loyalties and political indoctrination. As O'Brien's physical condition improved, he began to observe the daily operations of a German hospital that was managing to provide quality medical care despite severe resource constraints and constant military oversight. The dedication and skill of his caregivers challenged every assumption he had formed about German civilian attitudes and capabilities. Dr. Weber visited him daily, monitoring his recovery with the same attention she provided to German patients. Her professional demeanor combined German medical precision with humanitarian warmth that made him feel like a valued patient rather than an enemy soldier receiving grudging care. "Your healing progresses well," she observed during one of these visits, speaking in English that she was using more frequently to accommodate her American patient. "But you must be patient. Internal injuries require time to heal properly, and rushing recovery can cause permanent damage." O'Brien found himself developing genuine affection and respect for the German women who were saving his life at enormous personal risk. Their willingness to sacrifice their own safety for humanitarian principles was teaching him lessons about human character that no military training had addressed. Walsh had been assigned light duties helping with hospital maintenance and patient care, allowing him to remain hidden while contributing to the facility's operations. His presence created additional security risks, but it also provided companionship for O'Brien during the long weeks of recovery that lay ahead. The two American soldiers were discovering that their enemies were not the monsters that propaganda had portrayed, but ordinary people whose professional ethics and human decency had led them to choose compassion over hatred, even in the midst of brutal warfare. 3 weeks into his recovery, O'Brien had developed enough mobility to sit up in bed and take short walks around his hidden room, though his movements were still careful and deliberate due to his healing internal injuries. The daily routine of medical care had evolved into something resembling a small family, with Dr. Weber, Ingrid, Sister Marie-Claire, and even Walsh forming bonds that transcended their official relationships as patient, caregivers, and hidden prisoner. "Your color is much better today," observed Ingrid during her morning examination, noting the improvement in O'Brien's complexion that indicated his body was successfully recovering from the massive blood loss and trauma of his initial injuries. "Dr. Weber says you may be strong enough to sit in the garden tomorrow if the weather remains mild." The prospect of sunlight and fresh air was enormously appealing after weeks of confinement in the small hospital room, but it also represented increased risk of discovery by German patrols that regularly checked civilian facilities for security violations. Every expansion of O'Brien's freedom required careful calculation of benefits versus dangers. The hospital's garden was a small courtyard surrounded by high stone walls that provided privacy from neighboring buildings and casual observation. Dr. Weber had created the space as a recovery area for patients who needed fresh air but couldn't be safely moved to more exposed locations. "Many of our special patients have found healing in the garden," Dr. Weber explained to O'Brien as she planned his first outdoor excursion. "There is something about growing things and natural light that helps the spirit heal along with the body." The reference to special patients was Dr. Weber's euphemism for the various categories of people who had received clandestine medical care at the hospital throughout the war. O'Brien was learning that his case was unusual in its duration and complexity, but not unique in terms of the humanitarian principles that had motivated his treatment. Walsh had become an unofficial assistant to the hospital's maintenance staff, performing repairs and upkeep tasks that allowed him to remain useful while staying hidden from German authorities. His mechanical skills, learned during peacetime work in a Boston auto repair shop, proved valuable in maintaining equipment that couldn't be easily replaced during wartime. "The radiator in Ward 3 is working again," Walsh reported to Sister Marie Claire during one of their daily briefings. "I had to improvise some parts, but it should keep the patients warm through the rest of winter." The nun's grateful smile reminded Walsh that his contributions were helping sick German civilians as well as maintaining his own concealment. The irony of an American soldier improving conditions for German patients was not lost on him, but it demonstrated how humanitarian cooperation could develop even between supposed enemies. During his gradual recovery, O'Brien had begun learning German from Ingrid, who used language lessons as both entertainment and practical preparation for potential future emergencies. The conversations revealed personal details about the German women's lives that humanized his former enemies in ways that military briefings had never addressed. "My brother was killed fighting your soldiers in Normandy," Ingrid confided during one of their German lessons, speaking about painful personal experiences that she had shared with few people. "I hated Americans for months after receiving the death notice. But then I met you and Corporal Walsh and I realized that soldiers are just young men far from home, not monsters." The revelation was emotionally complex for O'Brien, who understood that Ingrid was providing compassionate care to representatives of the military forces that had killed her brother. Her ability to separate personal grief from professional responsibility demonstrated a level of emotional maturity that he found inspiring and humbling. Dr. Weber had begun sharing stories from her long medical career, including experiences during the First World War, when she had treated casualties from multiple armies without regard for their nationality. Her perspective on warfare as a medical tragedy rather than political necessity provided O'Brien with insights into civilian attitudes that contradicted official propaganda from both sides. "In my first war, I learned that young men bleed the same color regardless of their uniform," she observed, while changing O'Brien's bandages with the gentle efficiency that characterized all her medical procedures. "Pain is universal. Healing requires time and care, and death makes no distinction between victor and vanquished." The philosophical framework that guided Dr. Weber's medical practice was influencing O'Brien's understanding of the conflict and his role within it. He was beginning to see warfare from the perspective of people who dealt with its consequences, rather than those who planned its execution. Sister Marie Claire had taken special interest in O'Brien's spiritual welfare, offering religious counseling that drew from Catholic traditions that transcended national boundaries. Her conversations about forgiveness, redemption, and the universal human capacity for both good and evil provided intellectual frameworks for processing his complex experiences. "Perhaps God brought you to us to teach us all something about the possibility of peace," the elderly nun suggested during one of their talks. "When enemies can become friends through simple acts of kindness, it suggests that war is not the natural state of humanity." The theological perspective offered O'Brien a way to understand his experience as part of a larger pattern of human behavior that emphasized cooperation over conflict and compassion over hatred. It was a worldview that would influence his post-war life and career choices. As February gave way to March 1945, news of Allied advances and German retreats reached the hospital through radio broadcasts and reports from travelers. The war was clearly approaching its end, but the final stages of conflict often produced increased desperation and violence that made O'Brien's situation more rather than less dangerous. The SS are conducting increased security sweeps, Dr. Weber warned during one of their medical consultations. We may need to move you to a safer location if military pressure on the hospital increases. The prospect of leaving the sanctuary where he had been healed and cared for was emotionally difficult for O'Brien, who had developed genuine affection for the people who had saved his life. But he understood that continued presence endangered everyone who had helped him, and gratitude required consideration for their safety. Walsh had been developing plans for potential escape routes that would allow both Americans to reach Allied lines without compromising the security of their German protectors. His knowledge of local geography, gained through hospital maintenance duties, had revealed several possible paths through the Ardennes forests that might avoid German patrols. "If we have to leave," Walsh explained to O'Brien during one of their private conversations, "I've identified 3 different routes that could get us back to American forces, but we'd need to wait until you're strong enough for several days of hard travel." The escape planning was both practical preparation and emotional preparation for separation from people who had become friends rather than mere caregivers. O'Brien was discovering that leaving his German protectors would be more difficult than the physical challenges of reaching American lines. Ingrid had been teaching O'Brien about German culture, history, and social customs that provided context for understanding the civilian experience of the war. Her descriptions of life under Nazi rule revealed the complexity of a society where individual decency often conflicted with official ideology and political requirements. "Most Germans are not Nazis," she explained during one of their cultural discussions. "We are ordinary people trying to live good lives under very difficult circumstances. The war has been hard for everyone, but it has also shown us who we really are when tested by extreme situations." The insight into German civilian attitudes was valuable intelligence that O'Brien would eventually share with American authorities. But it was also personal knowledge that would influence his post-war perspectives on international relations and the possibility of reconciliation between former enemies. As his physical strength returned and his understanding of German society deepened, O'Brien faced the reality that his time in the sanctuary of Malmedy Hospital was approaching its end. The healing of his wounds had been accompanied by the healing of prejudices and misconceptions that would prove to be the most lasting benefits of his unexpected encounter with German medical compassion. On April 7, 1945, with Allied forces advancing rapidly through the crumbling German defenses and the sound of American artillery audible in the distance, O'Brien received news that would end his 3-month sanctuary in the Malmedy Hospital. Dr. Weber had received reliable intelligence that SS units were planning a final sweep of all medical facilities to eliminate any evidence of collaboration with enemy forces. "You must leave tonight," Dr. Weber informed O'Brien during what both understood would be their final medical consultation. "The Americans are less than 10 kilometers away, but the SS will be here by morning. If they find you, everyone who helped you will be executed." The prospect of leaving his German protectors created emotional conflicts that O'Brien had not anticipated when his recovery began. These women had saved his life, nursed him back to health, and demonstrated levels of compassion that had fundamentally changed his understanding of human nature and the possibilities for reconciliation between enemies. Walsh had prepared detailed escape routes based on 3 months of careful observation and planning. The irony was that reaching American lines would be more dangerous than staying in German-occupied territory, since retreating Wehrmacht units and desperate SS formations were conducting scorched earth operations that targeted anyone suspected of aiding Allied forces. "We'll travel at night through the forest paths that local hunters use," Walsh explained as he reviewed maps with O'Brien and their German helpers. "Mrs. Brennan's son knows the area and has agreed to guide us to the American positions near St. Vith." The teenager who would serve as their guide was the same age as many of the soldiers fighting on both sides, but his knowledge of local geography could mean the difference between successful escape and capture by German patrols. His willingness to help American soldiers demonstrated that the humanitarian principles that had motivated the hospital staff were shared by other members of the local community. Ingrid had prepared a parting gift for O'Brien, a collection of medical supplies and personal items that would help him during the journey to American lines and serve as reminders of his time in German care. Among the items was a small wooden cross that Sister Marie Claire had carved during her evening devotions. "To remember that kindness exists everywhere, even in war," Ingrid explained as she pressed the cross into O'Brien's hands. "And to remind you that Germans and Americans can be friends when they meet as human beings rather than soldiers." Dr. Weber's farewell was characteristically professional, but emotionally profound. The elderly physician had treated hundreds of patients during her long career, but her care for an enemy soldier, under circumstances that risked her life, represented the culmination of medical ethics that transcended political boundaries. "You have been a good patient and a good man," she told O'Brien as she conducted her final examination of his healed wounds. "Take care of yourself, and remember that healing is possible for nations as well as individuals." The wisdom reflected Dr. Weber's understanding that the personal relationships formed during O'Brien's recovery could serve as a model for broader reconciliation between Germany and America in the post-war period. Individual acts of compassion could demonstrate possibilities for international cooperation that transcended the hatreds created by political propaganda. Sister Marie Claire's blessing for the departing Americans drew from Catholic traditions that emphasized forgiveness, redemption, and the universal human capacity for both sin and grace. Her prayer acknowledged the complexity of warfare while affirming the possibility of peace through understanding and mutual respect. "May God protect you on your journey and grant you wisdom to share what you have learned about the power of love to overcome hatred," she said, while making the sign of the cross over both soldiers. "You have seen that enemies can become friends when they choose compassion over conflict." The escape itself proved less dangerous than anticipated, as German military units were focused on organized retreat rather than hunting for individual American soldiers. The 3-day journey through the Ardennes forests allowed O'Brien to observe the devastation that warfare had brought to civilian communities, reinforcing his appreciation for the sanctuary he had found in Malmedy. When O'Brien and Walsh finally reached American lines near St. Vith on April 10th, their arrival created complications that neither had anticipated. Military intelligence officers were suspicious of American soldiers who had spent months in German-occupied territory without being captured or executed, leading to extensive debriefings that questioned their loyalty and possible collaboration with enemy forces. "You're telling us that German medical personnel saved your life, nursed you back to health, and helped you escape to American lines?" asked Major William Harrison, the intelligence officer conducting O'Brien's interrogation. That level of assistance to enemy soldiers would constitute treason under German military law. Why would they take such risks? O'Brien's detailed account of his experience challenged American assumptions about German civilian attitudes and the universality of Nazi ideology among the German population. His testimony suggested that significant numbers of Germans had maintained humanitarian principles despite years of propaganda and political pressure. "Sir, these people saved my life because they believed it was the right thing to do," O'Brien explained during one of many debriefing sessions. "They weren't acting on orders or expecting rewards. They were following medical ethics that they considered more important than politics." The intelligence value of O'Brien's testimony extended beyond his personal experience to broader questions about German society and the possibilities for post-war reconstruction. If ordinary Germans were capable of the kind of humanitarian behavior he had witnessed, it suggested that denazification and reconciliation might be more achievable than pessimistic assessments had indicated. Walsh's corroborating testimony provided additional evidence of German civilian attitudes that contradicted propaganda stereotypes from both sides of the conflict. His observations of hospital operations, civilian behavior, and community attitudes offered insights into German society under wartime stress that would prove valuable for occupation planning. As the war ended with Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, O'Brien faced decisions about how to use his unique experience with German medical compassion. His story represented evidence that reconciliation between former enemies was possible when individuals chose to see beyond the artificial boundaries created by political conflict. Dr. Weber, Ingrid, Sister Marie Claire, and the other German women who had saved his life survived the final chaos of the war and continued their medical work during the difficult Reconstruction period. Their treatment of an American soldier became known to U.S. occupation authorities, earning them recognition and protection that helped their hospital continue serving the local community. In the years following the war, O'Brien maintained correspondence with his German caregivers, sending medical supplies and personal assistance that helped them rebuild their lives and their hospital. The relationships that had begun with emergency medical care evolved into lifelong friendships that demonstrated the possibility of healing between nations as well as individuals. O'Brien's post-war career as a physician was directly influenced by his experience of receiving compassionate care from supposed enemies. He specialized in trauma surgery and emergency medicine, carrying forward the humanitarian principles that Dr. Weber and Ingrid had demonstrated during the darkest period of international conflict. I learned more about medical ethics from German doctors than from any American medical school, O'Brien would tell his students years later. They showed me that the obligation to preserve life and relieve suffering recognizes no boundaries of nationality, politics, or personal safety. In 1955, O'Brien returned to Malmedy to attend the dedication of a new wing of the hospital that had been funded partly by American veterans who had learned of the medical sanctuary provided to Allied soldiers during the war. The ceremony brought together former enemies who had become friends through shared commitment to humanitarian principles. Dr. Weber, now in her 80s but still practicing medicine, served as the honored guest at the dedication ceremony. Her speech emphasized the universal nature of medical ethics and the possibility of building peace through individual acts of compassion that transcended political divisions. In this hospital, we learned that there are no enemies in medicine, only patients who need care, she told the assembled crowd of German civilians and American veterans. Perhaps the world can learn from medicine that healing is always possible when we choose to see our common humanity rather than our political differences. O'Brien's story became part of the historical record of American-German reconciliation in the post-war period, demonstrating that even the most bitter conflicts could be resolved through individual choices to extend compassion rather than seek revenge. The wounded soldier who had expected capture had instead found healing that extended far beyond his physical injuries. The German women who had nursed him back to health had planted seeds of understanding that would grow into the Atlantic Alliance and decades of cooperation between former enemies. Their choice to save one American soldier's life had contributed to the broader healing of nations that made possible the peaceful resolution of conflicts that had once seemed irreconcilable. If this incredible story of enemies choosing healing over hatred touched your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these powerful stories that prove compassion can triumph even in the darkest moments of human conflict. We're passionate about uncovering these forgotten acts of courage where medical professionals chose their humanitarian oath over political loyalty, risking everything to save lives regardless of nationality or uniform. These stories remind us that even in total war, individual choices to show mercy can plant seeds of peace that grow into lasting reconciliation. What moved you most about this transformation, from enemies to healers? The German doctor's unwavering commitment to medical ethics despite mortal danger, the nurse caring for representatives of the forces that killed her brother, or perhaps the lasting friendships that grew from this act of wartime mercy. And here's something to consider. In our modern world of political division, what can we learn from medical professionals who see patients rather than enemies, human beings rather than opposing sides? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how these stories of wartime humanity inspire you and what lessons they might hold for healing the divisions in our own communities today.